Thank you. I have never been introduced as the Prosperous. Such a great tagline. Jonathan Dodson, the Prosperous. Well, thank you for letting me speak on economic development and the Prosperous. I think to start, one of the mistakes I think we sometimes make is we assume that the father of the Prosperous is actually economic development. And I don't think that that's true. And so maybe what I can do is I can share with you my story and tie that into a greater understanding of who the disenfranchised are in our city, and then how we're supposed to maybe relate to them, and then where our city is headed and how we can think about that. And so I was in banking for about 8 years, and about 2.5 years ago I decided to leave banking. And so the reason I decided to leave banking was multifaceted, but the thing I was most interested in was this notion of reurbanizing the core. And so some of you may have been around and remember the 60s well, but in the 1960s, we had this great growth happening. Metro sales in the city were up 50%, but downtown sales were down 30%. And so what we had is you guys might remember that we had at that point the integration of schools and busing were enacted. And so as a city, growth was happening, but the downtown was suffering. And so what the downtown stakeholders decided to do was to try to fix that. So they did what we often do. They went and hired a consultant from out of state. And he said, there's two caveats to this. One is people are never going to use mass transit more than they're using right now, i.e. 1960. And you can't compete with the suburbs. You have to become the suburbs. So through various stakeholders and advertising companies and various people, we tore down very effectively over 200 buildings in our downtown core. And the problem that they didn't foresee was that there would be a greater economic downturn, and those empty lots stayed as empty lots. And it was even as late as the 1990s that someone came in and said, downtown's dead and we're the ones who killed it. And so I thought that was going to be the journey that I was going to be a part of, one of reurbanizing the core. But as part of my exodus from banking, I really felt like I should take it a step farther, and I decided to sell my car and ride my bike only. So for 18 months, rain or snow or sunshine, I was on my bike. In the summer times, I always had a sweaty back. And in the wintertime, I was usually pink nose and pink cheeks. And one of the things was it changed the way I viewed the city and what my calling was. What I realized was, as fascinating as reurbanizing the core is, there is a redeeming that needs to happen between the decision makers and those who are disenfranchised. And so I started officing. Instead of officing with mainly white, wealthy folks who drove luxury sedans, I found myself at coffee shops every day, officing with either people who viewed themselves as disenfranchised or associated themselves with people who were disenfranchised. And so this disconnect started bothering me. And so I wanted to say, well, who then are the disenfranchised? And what I realized was, I realized, one, it's not me. I'm not disenfranchised. The 35 to 60-year-old male in Oklahoma City is by no means disenfranchised. And there are plenty of groups that are disenfranchised, and so I'm going to be very specific in who I talk about today, mainly because it's lined up with some of my development and my passion. But what I realized is that 40 to 50% of wealth for a middle class is tied to ownership in their home. So if you take that from the 20s to the 30s to the 40s to the 50s, and grandparents sold their home and their kids got that, you create this very large nest egg for the middle class, all tied to home ownership. The problem is we know all the way up into the 70s, banks wouldn't even lend African Americans money to buy a home. And not only that, it was in the National Realtors Code of Ethics that said you weren't even allowed to show a black person a neighborhood that had white people in it because you might devalue their home. So this theory was not a one-time, we flipped the switch on and now people can borrow money regardless of race or religion. It had disastrous long-term effects because it had been going for so long. on top of that, we knew that, and I don't know if you heard this, but President Nixon's chief of staff just came out and said what everyone knew, but the war on drugs wasn't a war on drugs. It was a war on black people, and primarily black males. And we have more African-American men in prison than we did as slaves. And so if you want to step back and say we've got some issues as a city, we got some issues as a city, and it doesn't have to do with buildings that have been torn down. It goes much deeper than that. And so some folks I've heard this said, well, we don't have it's actually not a race issue, it's an economic divide. So it's not necessarily that we're racist anymore, we just, we want to encourage the wealthy. And I would say there are plenty of books that I would encourage you to read that would hopefully disprove that. But I would like to give you an example, an anecdotal example. I have a friend who was on the board of directors for a bank, and he'd gotten to the bank to a point that it was going to sell. And he was really a key stakeholder in this. And so the new bank, the acquiring bank, said, hey, we're going to take you on as one of our board of directors. And so everything was great until about a week before acquisition. And then he was called, and they said, hey, we're not going to have you be on our board of directors. And so he started calling around and trying to figure out what had happened. And what he found out confirmed his worst fears. The board of directors said, we've never had a black man on our board, and we're not going to start now. But they didn't use the word black man. And so this was 5 years ago in Oklahoma City. This is not surprising. Whenever I talk to my friends who are older, they say that racism is more insidious now than it was 40 years ago. And so what do we do? Well, I don't know completely, but I know part of it starts with understanding how do we neighbor the disenfranchised. And so I know some of you were at the Salt TED conference, and so you got to hear about my backyard again, and I apologize. But when we moved into our house 5 years ago, we moved next to some friends, and our friends, our yard and their yard was separated by a 3-foot-tall chain-link fence. And the chain-link fence was awesome because adults could talk over it, kids could talk through it, and then we could lift kids over. But what happened was we typically just stopped at that because no one really wanted to walk in through the house and go into the backyard and meet with them. So at some point we decided, well, let's put a gate in. So we put a gate in, and it was wonderful. Our kids started roaming their backyard, and brief conversations turned into long dinners. And then we're like, well, heck, let's do it to the other neighbor too. And so, we put that gate in over there. And so now my 1 yard became 3 yards, and my 4 kids became 10 kids, and it was awesome. And I'm standing on the back deck, and I'm like, what could be better than this? And my wife's like, well, let's tear it down and do it better and put a table on top. And then we can put stools on each side, and we can all eat at the fence. And so my fence became the Sporks of fences. We had a gate, a fence, and a table, and we eat at our fence line. And what that taught me was that neighboring actually occurs at the shared spaces. It doesn't occur in your dining room table. And so when I think about shared spaces for Oklahoma City, I think that we've got 80% of our public space, or shared space in Oklahoma City, are actually streets. And the streets are really only designed for one mode of transportation, the automobile. And so there is no way to interact with humans in a meaningful way if you are driving 60 miles an hour in the same direction or in opposite directions. And so one of the things we have to do is we have to change our shared space. We have to actually articulate a space, a street. We don't have protected bike lanes in over 600 square miles of a city. That's crazy. If you go to any of the minority-dominated areas of our city, more than likely you will not see protected bus stops. You will not see connected sidewalks. All of these say that we really don't care about you unless you drive a car. And we know that the burden of owning a car in this city is between $8,000 for an individual and $12,000 for a family. And so if you're a single wage earner and the parent of a family, that is another burden that's put on you that is not right. So if we're supposed to start neighboring in our shared spaces, I think we have to also ask where our city's headed. And so in The Great Inversion and the Future of the American City, Alan Ehrenhart says that we don't have a gentrification problem in our cities, we have an inversion problem. Wealth is coming from the edge and folding in to the core, and therefore pushing out the poor into the edge. And so we now have, Brookings Institute just did a study, we have more poor people in the suburbs than we do in the urban core. And so what happens when the poor are moved to the urban core is they are farther away from employment, They have no access to public transit because buses can't efficiently go out there because there's not any density. You can't actually create any safety net of social services that are consolidated because it's so sprawled. And so we have this we have this issue of we're going to be losing and isolating those who need help the most. And I think that's where our city is headed if we don't start taking some very drastic steps. So that's where our city's headed. Someone asked the question, they said, well, what actually makes a good city? And part of me, if I look around the country and I say, what do people think makes a great city? Well, we know millennials spend 20% more on food and beverage than any other generation. And what we're seeing is restaurants and bars pop up in downtown and other places and in other cities. And that's how we kind of like to judge it. But I think each of us would say, well, isn't a city supposed to be more than just a place that like feeds 20-something-year-olds? I hope so. And I think of even our downtown. And, you know, as we look around, we have these great views. I think our downtown is way more anemic than we realize. And we have been pursuing life and receiving lifelessness. And we've been pursuing this fabricated utopia and receiving instead homogeneity. And so I don't know how to fix that per se, but I do know that, and, you know, C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves, he said when one of his good friends died, he said, I just thought we were going to miss our friend. But what I realized was that one friend had the unique ability to draw out certain characteristics in each of us that also died with them. And so when a culture and power determines that they are culture enough, they miss out on everything because they can't even figure out who they are. They don't know who they are. And so what I would say is we have a downtown that doesn't even know who they are. And so we have shut our eyes to the virtues of those who actually have the things that I aspire to have. When I go and develop in any area, I actually don't get to bring anything other than money and access to power. Everything that I actually desire is what they have. And so that's what I get to be near to. And so I close in saying I have a couple questions that I would propose in terms of what do I want to see a city for my kids. And so what I say is, one last thing I want to say before I close is, it is important to say that there is this lie that is perpetuated here that if we can fix downtown, everybody else is going to get fixed. And I think everyone's heard it. And as a banker, I said it. Well, we just got to get downtown strong and then everybody's going to be okay. The problem is that we have been going after communities for the last 60, 70, 80, 90 years and poking holes in that boat. And so when the rising tide rises, it actually floods all those communities around us. It does not lift those communities. And so what I ask is, can you imagine a city whose wealth is not for power but for blessing? Can you see a city whose heartbeat is nearest the children and the elderly? Can you see a city whose justice system does not accommodate the powerful but creates justice for all? A city where the jail cell is not another form of indentured servitude? Can you see a city whose highways and byways become gateways? Can you see a city whose forgotten poor are remembered and known? Can you see a city who mourns not just for the unborn dead, but also for the born who are made dead? Can you see a city whose state had a portion of its land in Mexico, whose land was founded by Native Americans and helped settled by African Americans, actually take responsibility for the atrocities that we committed against them? Can you see a city who's less concerned with the skyline and more concerned about the historical narrative of the Red Line? Can you see a city whose telos finds its end in the virtue of love? Can you see this city? So my hope is that our attentions and our affections would be righted, that we wouldn't be worried about competing with other cities, but that we would be against and fighting against the fighting for the overthrown, the beaten down. For we know that the mightiest power of all is meekness, by recapturing a love for those our brothers and sisters. See, tolerance only requires us to put up with others. Empathy is fine because our numbness must awaken to their pain. But if we can be for those who are shouting and not yet heard and then get out of the way, for it's their story, it's not ours to tell, I think we can see a city that's both for 80-year-olds and 8-year-olds. Thank you.